For using my now husband's diary to get him to fall in love with me. My husband and I had been married for a few years now. We went to the same high school. I was a little weird in high school and he was a lot more popular than I was, and I had a really big crush on him, but I knew I had no chance. One day in class, I asked to go to my locker to get my homework, and my locker was really close to his, and I noticed that his locker didn't have a lock on it. And I know this was a complete invasion of privacy, but I was very curious, so I looked inside of his locker. When I looked in his locker, I found this notebook, and as I was reading through this notebook, it sounded like a diary. He wrote about his life and all the things that he loved and his hobbies and what was going through his mind. I basically hit the jackpot because I had a huge crush on him. So I took the notebook and I went inside the bathroom. I took out my phone and I took pictures of every single page inside his diary. Then I put his notebook back into the locker where I found it. My sneaky little self started messaging him through social media, and as we were talking, he seemed to really like me because we were so similar and had all the same interests. I was the perfect girl for him. 5 years later, he still doesn't know that I used his diary to make him fall in love with me. This is a story time of how my mom tried to get rid of me and my little sister. While my mom was pregnant with my little sister, my dad died, so she started using a lot of drugs. Once my little sister was born, she lost custody of us, and we had a close family friend taking care of us. My mom was never allowed to be alone with us. She would only get supervised visits. She started fighting really hard to get custody of us again, and then she finally did. I thought she fought so hard to get custody of us again because she would do better, but instead everything was the same. But the day would come when I would find out why she tried so hard to get custody of us again. Since she had custody of us, she was able to be alone with us. One day she said she had a surprise for us and told us to get in the car, and she blindfolded us. We were still blindfolded once we got to our destination, and she told us that we would have to play a game to get our surprise. She was standing pretty far away from us, but we could hear her voice. She said one of her friends were behind us and we would have to do a trust fall to get the surprise. I was holding my baby sister's hand and I felt her grip get tighter. For some reason I got a weird feeling and I decided that I didn't want the surprise from her. So I took off the blindfold. When I looked behind me, we were on the edge of the top of a building. Am I wrong for bullying my little sister into losing weight? Growing up, I had always been relatively skinny, so was everyone in my family, my mom, my dad, my 2 older brothers, and even my little sister. As we grew up, my little sister started to gain weight, and she was the only person in my family who was gaining a lot of weight. At first, it wasn't that much, but it got to a point where people started making comments about it. Don't get me wrong, my little sister has always been drop-dead gorgeous, but she found it hard to make friends, and as she got older, she started growing more interest in boys, but they didn't like her because of her weight. She was about to enter high school, and I know that high school can be brutal, and I didn't want her to get bullied, and I also didn't want her to have a bad high school experience. I didn't want her to not have any friends or to not get invited to parties all because of the way that she looks. So I slowly started making comments about how much she eats and how certain clothes didn't look good on her just to give her a hint. I love my sister to death, so I had to show her tough love. I know that it hurt her feelings and we got into arguments about it a few times, but eventually she started eating healthier and she would start going to the gym with me. And once she lost the weight, she became a lot more confident and started to fit in. If you are wondering whether or not to hook up with your ex-boyfriend, here is a sign not to. One day, my ex hit me up again. Let's call him Jaden. He hit me up and he asked me if I was single. I said yes. He told me that he was single too. And honestly, I missed him and he asked me to hang out one day. I was super excited to see him again and I was really looking forward to building our relationship over. He came over to my place and we talked for a bit. We watched movies, we cuddled, we kissed, and we did other stuff. The other stuff went on for hours, and I mean hours, because we had not talked to each other for 3 whole years. We broke up a really long time ago, and once we reconnected, we could not keep our hands off of each other. We cuddled and watched movies for the rest of the night, and eventually I drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to him getting dressed, and I asked why he was leaving and where he needed to go because I really wanted him to stay the night. He says he can't miss this wedding that he's supposed to go to early in the morning, and I understood, and I asked him who was getting married and to tell them congrats. He said thanks. It's my wedding. And then he left. This is probably the most tragic and preventable airplane accident you'll ever hear about. The facts of this story are so shocking that when the audio of what led to the disaster was discovered, investigators and airline officials couldn't believe their ears. The audio of this disaster is so unsettling, but I will include it at the end of this story. On March 23, 1994, Aeroflight 593 was on its way from Russia to Hong Kong. On this flight, there were 63 passengers and 12 crew members, 9 of which were flight attendants. Then there were 3 pilots responsible for flying the plane. 2 of the passengers on board were 16-year-old Elder Kudrinsky and 12-year-old Yana Kudrinsky, and they were the son and daughter of Yaroslav Kudrinsky, who was one of the pilots on this plane. Yaroslav was taking his kids on their first international flight, and he was a proud pilot and wanted to show his kids his workplace, but he may have went a little too far. As they were nearing Hong Kong, Yaroslav invited his kids into the cockpit, which is the front of the plane where all of the controls are. This wasn't a problem until Yaroslav Yaroslav encouraged his kids to get into the captain's seat and take turns flying the plane. He would soon regret this decision. Part 2 of what happened to Aeroflight 593. So pilot Yaroslav Kudrinsky asked his 12-year-old daughter Yana if she would like to get into the pilot's seat and fly the plane. Yana was a bit scared, but her father encouraged her that it would be fine. Now, Yaroslav wasn't actually going to let her fly the plane. He would only make it seem like she was. Once she got into the pilot's seat, autopilot would be turned on. He would press some controls that would turn the plane slightly to the left, and it would feel like she was actually the one turning the plane to the left. She kind of felt the control handle turning itself, so she knew it wasn't actually her taking control. Once she was done, it was now his 16-year-old son Eldar's turn. Now, when Eldar got into the pilot's seat, his dad messed with controls to make it seem like Eldar was flying the plane just like he did for Yana. Then he put the controls back to normal, which leveled the plane out. Then he left Eldar in the pilot's seat and got distracted and started talking to his daughter Yana. While Yaroslav wasn't paying attention, Eldar was in the pilot's seat, forcing the control handle to go into the direction that he wanted, which was fighting the autopilot, so the autopilot disconnected. Now 16-year-old Eldar is actually in control and is flying the plane. Part 3 of what happened to Aeroflight 593. 16-year-old Eldar is in the pilot's seat of Aeroflight 593 while it's in the air after being given permission from his father Yaroslav, who was a pilot on the plane. Eldar accidentally disconnects the autopilot and is now actually in control of flying the plane, which has 75 occupants in total. Yaroslav was completely distracted, so he didn't notice anything was wrong until Eldar asked, "Why is the plane turning?" In which Yaroslav responds, "Is it turning itself?" Eldar responds, "Yes." The plane is now at a sharp 90-degree angle and it keeps turning every second. At this point, Yaroslav should have immediately removed his son from the pilot's seat and took control of the aircraft, but he didn't. He just stood over Eldar in the pilot's seat, looking at the controls, trying to figure out what's wrong. Before they know it, the plane is going down at about 40,000 feet per minute. But the plane is going down at an angle. They're almost upside down. It's like going down the hill of a roller coaster, so they're being pinned back to their seats. Because of the amount of pressure from the plane going down, pinning everyone back to their seats, Eldar is unable to get out of the pilot's seat. Part 4 of what happened to Aeroflight 593. Now, all Yaroslav can do is yell demands at his 16-year-old son who has no knowledge on flying an airplane, so he can try and get the plane back on course before they all crash and die. The plane is being flipped in all different directions, upside down, on its side. The passengers are being tossed around like Caesar salad. Make sure to watch my Instagram story for the full animation and real audio recording. But I do warn you guys, it is very unsettling. Eventually, Yaroslav was able to get Eldar out of the seat and take control, but it was too late. The plane lost too much altitude and was flying too low and crashed into some mountains. There were no survivors. And what makes this even worse is that they were only 8 minutes away from their destination. After further investigation, they found that all Eldar had to do to keep the plane from going down was let go of the control handle, and the autopilot would have reconnected itself and set the plane back on course. Am I wrong for leaving my husband after I found out that he had cancer? So my husband and I had been married for about 10 years before we started becoming distant. A little while after, he actually cheated on me with one of my close friends. After that, nothing was ever the same between me and him. Now, don't get me wrong, I still loved him, but things could never go back to the way they used to be. Eventually, he fell sick, started losing a lot of weight, having trouble breathing, getting random rashes on his skin. So we both agreed that he should go to the hospital to get checked. So he went to the hospital and had to wait a few days to get the results. A few days had passed, so he went back to the hospital to get his results. When he came back home, I asked him what his results were. He said everything was fine, there was nothing to worry about. Then he put his keys on the counter and hopped into the shower. A couple days before, I had lost my credit card. I looked everywhere for it, couldn't find it, but the only place I didn't look was my husband's car. So I grabbed his keys while he was in the shower and I went to his car to look for my credit card. I was thinking maybe it fell out of my wallet while I was sitting in one of the seats. While I was looking for the credit card, I found a folder from the hospital he just went to. When I looked inside the folder, there was his test result. It was a biopsy test that confirmed he had cancer. So I went back inside to confront him for lying to me. Come back for part 2. This is part 2 of the story of me leaving my husband after I found out that he had cancer. So after I found the positive test results in his car that confirmed he had cancer, I went back inside to confront him for lying to me. I was sitting down waiting for him to get out of the shower. But then I kind of decided that I didn't want to confront him. Our marriage was already going downhill and I was already having thoughts about leaving him anyway. I mean, he did cheat on me with my close friend. I know this might make me sound like a terrible person, but I didn't want to be there for him. I didn't want to be his main support system mentally or physically. And cancer is a lot to deal with. I didn't want to be in and out of the hospital, spending multiple days there, sleeping there, paying all of the bills myself. It would be too much for me. So I decided I was going to pack my things and leave without telling him when or why. And I mean, he didn't know that I knew he had cancer, so he wouldn't think that I was leaving him because of that. So I knew I needed to leave before he decided to tell me he had cancer, so it didn't look like I left him because of that. So the next day, he went to work, and then I went to work. As in packing all my stuff, and then I left. Afterwards, he kept begging me to come back, so I blocked him, and I haven't talked to him since.